Welcome everyone to our second official Zoom session for our Staycation Shawl KAL. I'm absolutely delighted to see you all and chat more things in regards to shawls and knitting and tips and tricks. And of course, you'll want to stay with us for the, yes, you do see Lady Nutmeg, sorry. You'll want to stay with us for the entire evening here for the next hour because we will be giving away 3 gift certificates again that you can use to get anything that you want from our online store, or of course, if you are in Calgary or passing through in our actual store as well. So we will be doing draws periodically for nice little tasty gift certificates. And remember that you'll want to be posting your shawls and progress on social media as well, because I am in the mood to give out prizes, which means that we'll be drawing prizes for Instagram, we'll be drawing prizes for Facebook. There's been an amazing number of posts in the Facebook group that are so much fun. So if you're not in our Facebook group and you like Facebook, do think about joining it because there's been some really fabulous things shared there. And then, of course, we have a Ravelry thread. So we will make sure that everybody who posts is given an entry into some of these other draws. So there will be a grand prize and a couple of other associated prizes. And each time that you would post, we will count that as an entry so that you get lots and lots of opportunities to be a winner. Because let's face it, prizes and KALs are a lot of fun. So this time, what I wanted to do was to go over some more tips and tricks on the shawl, but I'm going to go and start from the middle of the shawl on. If you weren't able to join us before, or if you've started the KAL a little bit later, and we do have some wonderful people who have just started in, the inspiration, of course, is Vacation at Home, and it is a journey through a garden. My own personal garden is kind of an interesting mix of total chaos and wildflowers, and then an attempt to imitate the Bouchard Gardens in BC, because I do love their formal beds as well. So there are, sorry, I was just distracted by a chat. I'm just going to check that because... no, there isn't a special Facebook group for this KAL. We're just using the Ancient Arts Community group because it means you have less groups to join and less groups cluttering up your feed later on should somebody keep on posting in the group later. Anyway, so Bouchard Gardens, so there's formal beds in the shawl, there are wildflowers, and then there's a lot of tulips because tulips are something that I really love to grow, but unfortunately there are critters in my yard that eat them all, so all of my tulips are gone. So I put them in the shawl so that I can continue to enjoy them. Our yard is a little bit colder than some, so I was getting my tulips blooming all the way into July, which was really, really nice because I could sit outside and enjoy them. But unfortunately, apparently they're super delicious, and there was a couple of years where it was kind of amusing because you'd be going, oh, isn't that a pretty flower? And suddenly it will go and disappear under the ground. So somebody down there was enjoying my tulips greatly. And even though I tried protecting them in mesh and everything, they're all gone. They were delicious. So inspired by a garden. And something that I will mention too is that in order to be eligible for prizes, you do not need to have finished your shawl by the time that the KAL ends and we're awarding the major prizes. So don't worry about that. We all knit at our own rates, and this is a staycation where you're supposed to be enjoying yourself. So in regards to tips and tricks, I just want to refresh a few things too in regards to color choices. So if you have decided partway through your shawl that you want to change the order of your mini skeins, you can do that after the first set of the little stripes before the lace here. So if you've done these, it's okay to change the order of your mini skeins. After that, though, if you've gotten further and you've been doing more sections of color, you're going to have to leave the minis in the positions that you originally settled for, because I do want to warn you that when we get to the end border, several of these colors will use most of the rest of the yarn. You'll have enough to complete it with a little bit left over, but you don't want to run out partway through your tiny tulip border, which is this teal one here, and you don't want to lose enough to be able to do your final border on the shawl. So those 2 colors in particular are of concern. We don't want to run out of them. And then the other one that you'll definitely want to keep an eye on is where this purple is here. So that one gets a fair amount of use throughout the shawl too. So just reminding you that you can do a little bit of color changing here and there, but you've got to stay consistent with where those skeins are placed after you've knit the first panel of lace. So I have seen some people who've done a little bit of mixing and matching, and that's just fine. It's just like I say, keep an eye on that later on in the shawl. If you're using some stash yarn, or if you want to add in additional colors, go for it. One of the joys of shawls like this is that it's very flexible in terms of how you work with your colors. You just want to have a look at the pattern, and I made sure that on page 2, where it talks about what the shawl is shown in, that it gives you in brackets darker speckle, lighter speckle, solid, which is your darkest color, a medium color, and a lighter color. So just make sure to follow that roughly so that you have, if you're doing substituting or adding additional colors, if it's a darker color mini, keep with a darker color for that so you have enough contrast. Because one of the things that makes the shawl the prettiest is where you have enough contrast to be able to see your stitches. So in this section of the shawl, you can see that there is good contrast. So each one of the colors stands out and remains visible. And the slip stitches that are here are still visible as well. So substituting colors partway through, totally hands up, 2 thumbs if you want to do it. You don't need to, but like I say, just bear in mind that you want to keep contrast in those sections so that you can continue to see all the pretty things. Now, something else that'll give you an idea about contrast is, of course, you all have seen the original, which is on the cover of the pattern and all through it. It's lurking there behind me on, I don't know what her name is, but I'm going to guess it's Hortense because she's a little bit walks to the beat of her own drum. Anyway, that's the original shawl done with the dark gray. And this one's really fun because it uses the same set of mini skeins as the original, but it uses the beige background. So it looks a little different because you have a different level of contrast in this shawl. So with the beige, you'll see that this formal garden is a little bit less standing out than it is with the gray that you'll see in the photos in your pattern. Super pretty, lots of contrast still there. But it's really interesting to see how the character of a shawl can change just by changing the background color a little bit. So they both class as relatively light, but the shawl has quite a different character done in brown. So that was the little mention about the colors and things if you're changing some colors up that I just wanted to mention. I have seen a couple of shawls online that are super fun because there has been a little bit of playing with the colors there. And like I say, if you decide that you love this pattern and want to make more of them, it would be a great one to use up bits of color. So I don't know if you're like me, but they're all over my house. Although, unfortunately, Junior Studio Cat Indy has decided that he loves them, and they are currently all residing in glasses of water if he can get his paws on them. So I did notice when I got home today that all of the glasses of water and water bowls had stuff in them, whether it was fur mousies or my mini skein balls of yarn. So thanks, Indy. I guess that's going to slow me down a little. So, Heather, are we ready to draw our first gift certificate? Excellent. So Heather is going to draw from the people in the room right now. And then she will let us know who has won. And once we have our first draw done, then what we're going to do is dive into our first tip.
Okay, our first winner is Trudy Quail.
Didn't quite catch that myself.
I'm just putting it in the chat.
Perfect. So congratulations to our winner. Troudy?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Troudy Quail is the winner for our first $50 gift certificate. So Troudy, if what you can do is to email us, and Heather, if you can pop the email in for Wendy, which is sales@ancientartsfiber.com, just send an email in and we will gladly set up your gift certificate. All righty. Now, we are getting to the middle of the shawl. For many of us, we are getting to those giant tulips, and I put those in because when I had tulips, it was super fun. They were about 3.5 feet tall, so big, huge, juicy tulips, and you'll notice that there are baubles involved in that part of the shawl. So there's 2 things that you can do, well, 3 things actually that you can do there in the bauble section. First of all, if you are a person who despises baubles, and there are definitely people in my life who do, fun side fact, I actually put the baubles in there simply because I was teasing a friend of mine. Well, I like the look of them on the tulip, but I also was teasing a friend of mine who despises baubles, and so I could not resist putting them in. Anyway, if you are like my friend and do not like them, don't make them. All that you need to do in order to get rid of them is just knit the stitch that the bauble is actually formed on. Just knit it like it didn't matter, like there was no bauble there. Just make it a regular knit stitch and you will be just fine. So you won't have any issues in leaving them out at all. The second choice that you can make is to use your background color or to use your mini skeins to make contrast colors. So I have definitely seen people do it both ways. If you don't like sewing in ends and dealing with ends, and who can blame you on that one? You could make the bobble the same color as the background, in which case you would get to that stitch, and then you would just knit the bobble onto that stitch as the pattern shows. And then the third way, the way that I did it, was to use the mini skeins to put color pops on the tips of my tulips, just like you can see with this one here. And that just gave us a little bit of fun. However, because they are done technically as in tarsia, you're going to have to deal with the ends. And I'm going to give you some suggestions on how you can deal with the ends that will hide them so that you don't end up with them woven all through and showing so much on the back of the shawl. One of the challenges for this shawl is because of the reverse stocking stitch. If you do regular weaving in of the ends, you're going to get that showing quite a bit. And I myself, it's not got a beautiful wrong side, but I don't want to have it any worse. So somebody asked, what tips can you share if you choose to use seed beads? So if you wanted to use beads, there's a couple of things that you could do. You can break your yarn and thread them onto the working yarn and put them on that way. If you wanted to have them on right from the start, you'd have to feed them onto your skein of yarn and hold them for a long way, sliding them along, and that would be a little bit frustrating. Or what I would suggest is to put the beads on later. So what you do is just knit that stitch, and then you can sew some beads in place. And that's where you would be able to use a larger bead if you so chose. Or I have had people suggest using buttons. And of course, I immediately had my mind, I go to using some of those beautiful vintage buttons that one can find that I never know what I'm going to do with. So there's lots of options there. There are ways to put beads into knitting without having them threaded onto the yarn. And I'm not going to get into that because there's some complexity to that, but you can definitely Google it. I just myself would probably sew them on later because I would want to put something a little bit larger and fancier. So I will admit, I have a collection of lampwork beads and I would probably be choosing something like that. So not the best answer, but a kind of fun one. Karin has pointed out a cluster of small beads would look nice too, and I completely agree. And one person, and I had totally forgotten about this, but one person said to me, what about the idea of using some of her old earrings? So she was just going to take the finding off, and I'm like, that would be cool too. So it doesn't have to be a flat item or a single item. You can put whatever you want on the tips of the tulips just to emphasize those points and give it a little color pop there. Now, in terms of working bobbles, I want to show you how to work a bobble because not all of us have done them, and there's so many different ways to do them as well. So I have a swatch, and I'm going to switch cameras in just a moment. And the swatch is what I'm going to use to show you. It's big yarn again on my favorite pink needles so that you'll be able to see it a little more clearly. But when you go to work the bobble, let me just find where it is here. So, oh my goodness, that's what happens. I know exactly where it is in the original. Good Lord. Should have looked at the pattern earlier. Okay. So in the actual instructions on page 6 for that section, it doesn't tell you where the instructions for the bobbles are. Slipping the stitches. Where is the working the bobble thing? Stitches. Oh, I'm being stupid. I went right by it 3 times. So how to actually make the bobble instructions are on the top of page 3 in the left-hand column. So this is a really typical way of doing a pattern, is to having that on a separate page so that you can refer to it off and on as you go throughout the pattern. So what we're going to do is put a bobble into this swatch I've done, and this is part of the actual tulip chart that we have here so that you can kind of see how it sits on there. Now, let me just switch to my other camera. Spotlight. There's my lovely arm, and we have our lovely baby aubergine swatch. Before I start the bobble, I just want to point something out, which is, remember how last time we talked about yarn overs and yarn over size? When I was knitting this swatch and I was doing the outsides of the tulip, so this is where the petals are, the point of the petal, and then this is where the background resumes in the tulip. So the tulip is forming a V. This is in between the tulip petals. What I've done is I've made those larger yarn overs that we talked about before, because that really does emphasize those petals. So it was just a little choice I made as a knitter to make those larger than the ones in the middle. So you'll notice there's a difference in size. And let me put that on a white background because some monitors are not going to show that as nicely as they could. And so we see our nice V's, and you see how there's two different bobbles, or not bobble, yarn over sizes here. It just is one of these tricks as a knitter that you can use in order to emphasize or de-emphasize certain things in this pattern as well. So when I was knitting this swatch, I was having some fun with yarn overs, and this was the type of yarn over where the yarn is going a full circle around the needle, both whether I am doing it in between knit stitches or between a knit to a purl, etc. So with the bobble, just going to check how many stitches in I am. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What have I done with my yarn? Oh, look at that. I had my swatch upside down. No wonder it looked weird. Okay. Anyway, we need to get this. You know, I was saying I'm going to get my swatches all set up so that this time I won't have any fumbling to do with them. Yeah, that didn't obviously happen. I forgot to get to the stitches where we're doing this. So we have, there's a garter border on this if anyone's wondering why I knit 3 there. So we're now at the stitch where we're going to put a bobble, and I'm going to do this in a contrast color. So what I'm going to do is take my contrast color, whatever that might be. In this case, I'm going to use some white yarn. You're going to move the main color that you're going to go past this bobble stitch with after to the back of your work, because you're actually going to slip the bobble stitch itself if you're making the bobble in a separate color. So move it to the back, and then using a contrast color of your choice, you're going to knit 5 stitches into 1 stitch for the first part of your bobble. So in this 1 stitch, I am going to knit 5 stitches. Well, I'm going to work 5 stitches. So what we're going to do in order for those to sit properly later on is that we're going to alternate knitting. So there's 1, then we bring the yarn to the front, and then we're going to purl a stitch. Move the yarn to the back, we're going to knit a stitch. Move the yarn to the front, we're going to purl a stitch. And then we're going to knit a stitch. So that's going to give me 5 loops on my needle. So I have now made 1 into 5 by doing that. So you knit, you purl, you knit, you purl, you knit. And I'm just going to do that again so everyone can see what I did. You'll notice that stitch is going to naturally just pull big and loose, and don't worry about that. That is just fine. So in order to start the bobble, we're going to go from 1 stitch to 5 by going in and knitting. We do not pull the stitch over the needle on the left. Move the yarn to the front and do a purl. Move the yarn to the back, do a knit. Move the yarn to a front, do a purl. Move the yarn to a back and do a knit. That's when you can let that stitch fall off that left needle, because you've got all 5 of your stitches made into that 1 stitch. Then we turn the work, and this is where there's a little bit of turning back and forth, but there's not so many bobbles that it's annoying. And at this point in time, we're going to purl 5. So we're not going to go past the new stitches that we added here for our bobble. And I'm doing this at a very basic level because not all of us will have done this before. Now, where you started, your yarn is not secured, and you can just give that a little tug to bring that first stitch on the row below to a more reasonable size. When we finish the bobble, that's all going to get dealt with. So you don't have to worry about that too much. So now, once we've knit or we've purled the 5, we turn our work, we're going to knit 5. So we're going to knit the right side row here. And then we're going to repeat from the asterisk. So that means that we're going to turn the work and we're going to purl 5 again. And what we're doing is essentially we're knitting a little square. If you wanted a bigger bobble, then you would have more stitches here. And you could shape it a little bit, but for this particular bobble, I went with a nice fat bobble that is really easy to do and not complicated. So you see how we've made this little square, and that is your bobble. So we have repeated that one more time, and now it says pass the 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and 1st stitch over the 5th stitch. And this can really throw people when they read that, because they're like, well, which stitches are they talking about? So when we say the 5th stitch, that's actually the 5th one worked from the start of the bobble. So it's the 1st stitch sitting on the needle that you would have, or 1st stitch from the tip. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the stitch next to it and pass it over. Then we're going to take the stitch that's there next to it, pass it over. Next stitch, pass it over. Next stitch, pass it over. And so we're back down to one stitch. So at this point in time, all we have to do is break the yarn. Our bobble is finished. It doesn't look particularly beautiful at this point in time, but we're going to shape that little guy a little bit later as we come back along the row and turn him into that nice round blob that we would expect. So at this point in time, I'm going to pick up my main color and I'm going to cross over those two ends and I'm going to continue with my row. So at this point in time, I have to purl 5. Why did I stick my needle in that stitch? No one will ever know. Okay. Yarn over. Now I was talking about going all the way around the needle. So in this case, I'm going to go all the way around the needle or that way, and it gives you a different length of yarn. So again, just try and be consistent with what you're doing. I'm going to do this, then I have to do, right, SSK. It's always weird when you're doing this, when you're doing a class, because you're like, okay, should I keep on talking or should I go silent on them? Knit 2 together, yarn over. Now, with this one, in order to get my yarn to the front, I had to go a long distance. This one, I took a shorter route, so these two yarn overs won't match. You can leave it like that, or in this case, I could have gone that longer route that I showed you first, and that would have then meant that these would be the same size. I'm not going to go back because we can do another example of those if anyone has questions about it. It's all in the first Zoom video. So now I have purled my 5 and I am back at my stitch where I'm going to work my next bobble. So once again, take the main color, move it to the back. Then you take the color that you're going to work your bobble in. And just like the last time, we're going to turn this one stitch into 5 stitches by going into that stitch and knitting, then purling, then knitting, then purling, and then knitting. And if you were doing a super huge bobble, like a certain infamous sunflower sweater that people have heard me talk about before, this would have been a lot more stitches and you would have had a nice funky yarn over hole in the bottom of the stitch. I have got my 5 into 1 now, so I have 5 stitches on the needle. So I'm going to turn my work and I'm going to purl my little tiny row. Now, if you know how to knit backwards, you can certainly do that too. That is a little bit beyond the scope of our Zoom because of time constraints. But it's a fun technique to learn. This stitch got really big because the yarn isn't fixed. So again, I just give it a little bit of a tug to get that little rascal under control. So now I'm going to come along here and I'm going to knit the 5 stitches. And again, like I say, the bottom looks a little messy, but it's all going to magically come together. And then we repeat from the star or asterisk. So we're going to go and purl the 5 stitches. Turn the work and we're going to knit the 5 stitches. This is your number 1 stitch, number 2 stitch, number 3, number 4, number 5. Like I say, that can sometimes throw people. And so I just wanted to point out how they're numbered. This may be the one that's closest to the needle. So you'd think of that one sometimes as being number 1, but it's the 5th one worked in the bobble. So that's why it's referred to as the 5th stitch. Then we're just going to one at a time, pass these over until we're down to 1 stitch again. And then all we have to do is break our yarn. So again, it's not a very pleasing shape at this point, but this too shall change. And you can give it a little poke at this point and just get them to sit there a little bit more round. You could, if you wanted, slide these stitches at the bottom together, but what I'm going to do to finish it will solve that issue without having to go to the trouble of doing that. So now what I'm going to do is finish this row, and then I'm going to just knit back so that then we can show you how to hide those ends and what to do with them. Oops, it's supposed to be a purl, not that it really matters in a swatch. And I will tell you, in this nice big fat DK yarn, these are really juicy bobbles. Alrighty. So let's just work back along this row. Always very exciting watching somebody else knit. It's funny how we all do this differently, all different hands. And for those who don't know what I'm doing as I drop stitches all over the place here and so on, I'm actually flick knitting, which is a little bit of a different way to knitting. When I come to this contrast stitch that the bobble is on, just knit it like normal. It's now back to being a regular stitch that's treated like a regular stitch. So whatever the pattern shows to do there, and I'm just purling back across the row so that we can finish our bobbles, you would just then work it as normal. This is technically an intarsia bobble because it's done with a separate color, but you don't have to carry yarn anywhere crazy the way that you would with more elaborate intarsia. If you've never worked intarsia before, you can pat yourself on the back because you will be doing your very first intarsia. If you are a master of intarsia, well, this is about as simple as it gets. Okay, so you can finish your bobbles off later, or you can deal with them right away. I'm just going to grab my needle here. So what I do to finish the bobble is I'm going to take my tails, and I'm actually going to do something that will have some knitters gasp in horror. I'm going to tie them in a knot. And what I want to do is a granny square, and I want to run that tail through there twice. So what I did was I took the two ends, loop them around each other, take the tail through, take it through a second time because then it can't slip. Because one of the things that you want if you're tying a knot in knitting is for your knot to never come out again. And then we're just going to gently pull that knot tight. And when you turn your knitting around, look at that, your bobble is now magically round. And if he's not perfectly round, you can give him a little bit of a tweak. But by pulling those two tails tight, it gives you a nice round bobble. And then I want you to tie that knot again, because again, we don't want our knots to come undone. And now that's going to be fixed there in perpetuity. So a lot of people don't believe in knots in knitting, but I am descended of my mother and my grandmother who did production knitting in the 30s and 40s, and they always tied knots because they had no time to deal with all of this fancy schmancy weaving in. So they would have tied a knot, and then if they wanted to, they'd come back and they'd weave the ends in later. So tying a knot is legitimate in this case because it's going to pull your bobble together nicely, and that double loop on the knot is what's going to keep it from undoing itself. Now, what I'll do is I'll take my tails and I'm going to run them into the bobble itself. And that will hide the tails without having to worry about where do you put them in here that won't show. So I'm just going to run them right into the bobble itself. And I'm going to stab that poor innocent little bobble. And I'm going to bring my needle up through it. And then what I'm going to do is follow the path of one stitch and just stab right back down through it. And I will show you that a little more closely here. So I just gave it one stitch. Let's see if the camera will show it. There we go. Following the path of a stitch that exists, and I pull the tails back down through, and you will never see them. And then what you can do is just snip them off. Boy, it would be handy if I had my scissors on this table here, wouldn't it? Yeah, I had to leave them far away. Okay. You don't have to follow the way that I did that. You can do that however you want, but that's a nice, simple way to do this that will hide your tails and not be a lot of work, and it's not going to come undone. So on the back, it's a nice, clean, tidy back. All you can see is that one stitch now. So let's finish the other bobble here. Again, we're going to take our tails, we're going to cross them over each other, loop through twice, and then we're going to gently pull them nice and snug. And what that does is that tightens our bobble in. And you remember that very first stitch that was all floppy and loose? Now the problem is solved. It's no longer floppy and loose. And then again, to finish your knot, pull that nice and tight. And then what we're going to do is take our ends and we're going to run them into the bobble itself. So you're just going to stab straight up into your bobble. It's going to come out the top, your needle, through a hole. And then what we're going to do is go back. So just follow the path of a stitch and go back down through your bobble and come out the back side. And now this guy, I deliberately left him a bit lumpy because I'm like, oh, I don't like this bobble. He's not as nice and round. So just grab the bobble with your needle or with your fingers, you can manipulate it and just make him a little bit more round. If you need to, give the background yarn a bit of a tug, and then that'll get that all nice and pulled together at the bottom. So you can plump your bobble with your needle a little bit if you don't like the shape of it, and then it will be nice and round, and then trim your tails. So are there any questions about bobbles? Feel free to turn your mic on if you'd like. Okay, just checking the chat here. Yeah, so much stitching for a cute little detail, but they're adorable later, Heather. Go bobbles. And for anyone who loses their internet, we will be posting this again. So we will have this go up on YouTube and you'll be able to rewatch this. Alrighty, so that was doing bobbles. This is a very simple form of a bobble, but it's a nice one. And in the big yarn here, you can see how that stitch got a bit loose there that it's knit into in the bottom. So again, you can just pull gently on your knitting and it will help to snug that up a bit. It's perfectly normal to see a little bit of that bottom stitch through the bobble. And it's interesting how when you block it, it just all disappears, because when you block, the whole background fabric is going to get evened out and smooth, and that will automatically help finish off that last little bit of lumpiness in the bobble. Okay, next, another tip. Slipping stitches. So we get from our tulips and we've been moving along and we've been having ever so much fun. And eventually you're going to come to the wildflower garden border chart. Which one is that? That's this pretty thing here. And this is an interesting one because you have been slipping stitches when you're doing your mosaic. And this is technically a mosaic, but it's also one that has you slipping the same stitch in some cases for 4 rows instead of for 2. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that because there's a couple of different ways to handle those slipped stitches. So I've sort of tried to duplicate our colors here in my swatch. Now, I have not done anything to deal with the tension on my 4 stitches slipped stitch, or 4 rows slipped stitch here, because I wanted to show you 2 different options. One of them is that once you have knit this whole section, you can go in and just gently give that a tug. And what'll happen is that you're going to then have that stitch be lying nice and level instead of pulling the fabric in. So it's going to stretch it out. And where it's going to get its slack is actually it'll pull from the row that it's knit in. And you're never going to notice any nasty bumpiness there later on, but this will allow you to flatten it out. If you wait to block and do this, sometimes they don't all pull smoothly. So what I would do is go along and do this so that this is ready for blocking, that these are the length they need to be. The other way that you can do this is that you can go and you can tug them as you work the next row. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to come along and we're going to do that nice bit of brown. That's the next part of this pattern. And I even started to shape this. Yay. Now, a little trick is to make sure that you have enough slack when you are carrying your yarn up the side. We have enough slack. We're knitting along, making sure you can see what I'm doing. And when you come to this stitch, if you're having trouble pulling them and tugging them, take the stitch and before you do anything with it, give it a little tug. And did you see how it pulled out? I'm going to keep on doing this so you can see it. And I think actually what I might do is put a white background there so that it shows a little better. So I have knit this, or rather tugged this stitch out. I put it back on my left-hand needle, and now I can go along and I can knit it. So we'll knit this guy, we knit the next 3. And then we come to another one of these slipped stitches that's been slipped for 4 rows. And what we do is we just give it a little tug, and you see how it pulled out so that it's now no longer pulling the fabric into a buckled position. Put it back on the left needle and just work it. So these are the 2 different ways that I find very nice for handling these big, long slipped stitches. So just take your right needle, give it a little tug. If you pull it to be too loose, don't worry about it. When you block the shawl, that will come back out again. So I wanted to show you this because not all of us will have done these long slipped stitches, and there's 2 different ways to handle them. This one, should you decide after this to boldly go and do Stephen West's Aurora Cabin shawl, is a very nice way to handle those giant long slip stitches in that shawl too, because if you're trying to pull them up later on, I can guarantee you they will not have the right amount of slack in them, and then you will shake your fist at them, and you will curse Stephen West gently, even though you secretly love him, and you will wish that you had gone and done this particular way of stretching them out in the first place. But I was never near that shawl, really. I didn't do it. But again, here I have the stitch up. Just give it a little tug and then put it back on the needle here, and you can work it. And you can see that these are now not lying nice and flat. They're not pulling the knitting in either, so it can now stretch out. And when I go to block it, I'm not going to have any issues with any buckled fabric. I myself prefer this particular method to pulling them out later, simply because I can control it and make sure that they are pulled out all the way. Again, just give it a little tug. But that's probably too because I do a lot, if I'm doing these slip stitch patterns, of ones where they're being carried more than 4 rows. So it does give you a lot of control. And remember, if you pull it too loose, don't worry about it. The blocking will solve it. I think in all of the bazillion of them in Aurora Cabin, I only had one that stayed a bit looser than I wanted it, and I cannot even find it now. So not a big deal. And when we lay our fabric out, it's now sitting differently from how it was before, where you see these are now at a proper distance. So we have the same thing in this section that we did earlier, where we have mosaic that's alternating stocking stitch with garter. And this just helps those stitches ease over that garter stitch and not pull in your whole section there. So it's a really fun little stitch. You can do a lot of fun things with colors with this. And that is just my little tip to help you with tensioning that. Alrighty, now we get to draw another prize. So Heather is going to draw someone's name, and she will announce who it is in just a moment.
We're going to get Wendy to do it this time.
Oh, we're going to get Wendy to do it. Go, Wendy.
Yeah. We're behind the scenes. Chatting back and forth.
My random number generator says our winner is Fran Galbraith.
Congratulations to Fran Galbraith. Remember to email Wendy at sales@ancientartsfiber.com, and she will set up your gift certificate for you. Okay, the last tip that I want to show you is about the border of the shawl and this knitting on. This is something that some of you may have done before, and some of you may not have. And the first time that you do it, you're like, what is this? Because you're knitting a border onto some already live stitches, and it'll be like, how? So that's why I want to demonstrate this. So the border is done in a contrast color. And what we're going to do is in the first stitch here, when we're ready to work our border, we are going to cast on 3. And you can just use a simple knitted cast on for this. You don't have to do anything fancy. A knitted cast on is nice because you knit the stitch and then put it on the needle to the left, knit the stitch, put it on the needle to the left, tug on the end because it's annoying you. And so we've cast on 3 stitches. Now from here, you can work the little chart for this, or you can use the written instructions. I always do both because I know that all of us have different preferences. But the thing that confuses people is joining onto the live stitches. So trying to find my tiny chart. There's my tiny chart. So the wee little chart here has you doing a slip stitch at the beginning of the row. And then you're going to work these stitches. And the last one is where you're going to, on the next row, is where you're going to work them together with the border. So when we go back to the instructions there, it's not really as verbose as it could be because I keep getting tech editors telling me to not say so much. So what it says is that you're going to work row 1 of the lace border chart to the last stitch of the chart, and then you're going to knit this together through the back loops with 1 stitch from the shawl body. So let's do that. So the first row of this chart is not terribly difficult. We're slipping the first stitch. We're doing a yarn over. I guess I could go to the chart so you guys could see it. Oh, slip stitch. We're doing the knit one, so it's a good thing that I went. What have I done here? Oh, Well, now there's something interesting that I never even thought of. So on that setup row, you cannot slip the first stitch. You have to knit it because it just wants to come off if you've done a knitted cast on. Anyway, knit the second one, yarn over. Now we come to the last stitch and we come to the first body stitch. And what it says, why did I not put tabs on here? What it says is that you're going to knit this stitch together through the back loop with one stitch from the shawl body. So what does that mean? Well, we have our extra stitch. This is the last stitch of the lace border. We have the first live stitch on the needle. We're going to put the needle through the two back loops of the stitches. This needle does not want to go through these two. Stop it, rascals. And then you knit them together. That has gotten rid of one body stitch. There's all sorts of different ways to do this. You can knit it on the right side row, you can knit it on the back side row. And then the first stitch of this row is slipped according to the chart. And then what we are going to do is simply knit back. So we knit our 3 stitches. So we've now gotten rid of one body stitch and we have knit 2 rows of our chart. So we're just going to keep on working like this as we work our chart. So now we can start slipping our stitches. Now, because we knit the last stitch, we're going to slip that stitch with the yarn in the front and move it to the back to work the next row, which is knit 1, yarn over, knit 1. And then this last stitch of the chart is again knit 2 together through the back loop. Why I chose black needles and dark brown yarn, no one will ever know. So we knit 2 together through the back loop. Turn the work, slip. And again, done with the yarn in front. And then we're just going to knit back to the edge. I am hoping that this is showing reasonably well on the camera. And if somebody is finding this confusing, just let me know. Now we are on row number 5. Slip the first stitch, knit a stitch, yarn over, and then we have a knit 2 together, yarn over, and then again, we are going to knit the last stitch of the chart together with a body stitch through the back loop. So what this does is it starts carrying a nice little border along the edge of your chart, of your shawl rather, and it actually has the stitch floating horizontally along while your lace is being formed. So when we go to this one, you can see that exact effect there. So by knitting through the back loops, what we get is this nice horizontal knit stitch that looks very finished. And if you're curious about the derivation of the lace, this is actually a version of Orenburg lace. So the Orenburg lace way of knitting is done in a way that was designed to be simple and fast and easy to remember. So they always knit all the stitches. It's not done with knits and purls, it's just garter stitch lace. And so what I did was I took one of those patterns and adapted it to be a nice narrow little edging, because garter stitch lace is also nice and strong. So it gives you a nice plump, strong edging that will finish off the live stitches of the body while applying the lace at the same time. And you can see the body stitch there too. Let's get this up nice and high. You see how it's twisted? So that means you don't have a hole there. So knitting through the back loops will twist that stitch and have your border floating horizontally too. So it's a really nice way to finish off a shawl edge. And I will admit that I really enjoy knitted cast-offs on things. Let's get this under the camera again here, because they can be really creative and really beautiful. And these are historical too. So you'll find them going back a couple of hundred years in stitch dictionaries and patterns where people are using these edges and knitting them onto the bodies of other pieces, whatever it is. And you'll also find sometimes what they'll do is they'll actually knit them onto fabric as well. So sometimes they would knit the border and sew it on, and other times they would actually knit the border straight onto the fabric, which is really cool. So I have a few of them lurking somewhere in my basement where my grandmother had done that. She had actually knit the border straight onto a pillowcase because there were some holes on it. So she just went ahead and did that. Are there any questions about that? And again, feel free to unmute. No? Well, that is great. That means I did my job. And like I say, you can always go back to YouTube and you can have a look at those again. In the meantime, is there anybody who would like to show off their progress? I would love to see some shawls. And while we're doing a little bit of show and tell, soon there will be another draw. Just warning, Heather and Wendy.
Okay, I'll show mine off.
Excellent.
I'm wearing it and I'm getting a little bit warm here.
Yeah, no kidding. So let me know who you are when you're going to show your shawl off, and then what I'll do is I'll spotlight you.
Oh, I'm Sigrun.
Perfect.
Yes. Oh, here
Oh,
I am.
wow.
Okay, now I have to confess I didn't do the tulips, which of course made it a bit faster. Okay. Um, just they're very pretty, but they just weren't me. So I left them off, but otherwise, yes, I finished the whole thing.
Well, I think it's absolutely beautiful. And that was actually a really brilliant way of doing some modification to the shawl. One of
Yes.
the things that I will admit to is I never leave somebody's design alone. I'll always tweak something to be a little bit more me. And leaving the tulips out is a really great way to do that. So what you've done is to continue the texture stitch, and that is so pretty. So
The
yeah,
texture,
absolutely
yes,
lovely.
it's a wonderful stitch. You could have a whole scarf out of that one, I have to say.
Oh, absolutely.
No,
I will admit I love this texture stitch, and if you have a look at my Roman Villa shawl, you'll find something very suspiciously familiar in there.
oh, okay, I will. Okay.
Well, thank you. Very much appreciated. Is there someone else who might like to show a shawl off? Doesn't have to be finished. Ooh, Grace, yes.
Oh, the pretty pink. Yes, I love that.
Okay, so I had some of my own minis. So I went to my local yarn shop and um, uh, chose this pink, this dusty rose. And
I think
then
that's gorgeous.
what I also didn't, well, I did the I'm in the middle of doing the tulip border, but I'm
Mhm.
going to not put the baubles on. And I have an idea to, after I block it, I may embellish the shawl with some embroidered
Oh,
borders.
fantastic. That is a brilliant idea. I love
So,
it.
so I was just concerned that the baubles were gonna, in I don't know, 10 years from now they'll fall off with wear. So I'm just gonna. This is something really precious I want to keep for a really long time.
Well, I think that's a brilliant idea. I love it. Thank you so much. Is there someone else that would like to share a shawl?
I can. I'm in the middle of a row, but it's the one where I got the colors based off of your naughty little rabbit.
Oh, how fun. I
So I'm
love it.
using,
Isn't that cute?
and the main color is a golden terrier, the golden retriever. So I guess I'm playing with a rabbit and a dog in the garden.
Okay, that is so neat. Talk about totally like a Peter Rabbit type theme, because of course one of the things in the stories is Peter Rabbit there that's, skipping around and avoiding all that kind of good stuff. So thank you so much for sharing that. I see that Gail has her hand up. So Gail, did you want to share a shawl or ask a question? Your camera and microphone are off right now. There's your camera. Yay!
Hi, sorry, I'm just trying to turn my camera around. I haven't done a whole lot of Zooms before, so I'm trying to figure out how to turn my camera here. There we go. I'm sorry about the shot, but this is as far as I've gotten. I'm really loving the fall colors in this. And this, I'm not quite up to the bauble stage yet, but I think I might want to incorporate either depending on what's coming up next, whether it's going to be this lovely teal color or the yellow, the mustard yellow.
Very fun. That's beautiful. It's coming along really well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you for the great instruction.
You're very welcome. So is there anyone else who wants to share? Karin, I'd love to see it.
I too am in the middle of a row. I'm almost done with the tulips. I have my first set of baubles.
They look
And
fantastic.
I think my next right side row is the last bauble row. So I'm very close
Well, it is sure coming along fast, and it's absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you.
This is so exciting.
Love
I know
it.
it sounds like I don't get out enough, but it's so neat to see how everybody's doing the same project, but making it so unique to themselves. Okay, thank you, Karin. We have a couple of people. So Tanya, you have your hand up, and Gail Mitchell. So who would like to go first? Or did we just do Gail? I may be losing my mind. Heather, do you know who the last person I spotlighted was before Karin? Since I'm
I
losing my
think it
mind.
was Gail. No, I think it was
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, so then Tanya, I am going to put the spotlight on you.
All right. So I made some changes to the colors. I'm using Grand Canyon instead of maple. That's sorry, I don't know if you can see that or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I think the main difference between the maple and the Grand Canyon is that Grand Canyon has a little bit of teal that gets pulled through on it. So I kind of like that variation in there anyways. And I wasn't overly fond of the birch leaves for the yellow, so I went with marigold.
Very nice.
I think it just stands out a little bit better.
Yeah, it's a warmer color too. So along with the Grand Canyon, which is a very warm color, I really like it. And that's super cute for that band of tulips there.
Yeah, it is actually. And of course, oh gosh. First time I'm doing this on an iPad, so don't mind me. And of course, the bobbles, I totally made them the wrong way. I have a problem reading a pattern. Instead of doing the knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, what I did was knit front to back, knit front to back, knit front to back into the same. And it does something a little different, but what I ended up doing was I stuffed the bobbles with the leftover yarn. So, yeah, I think you know what I mean? With the ends, when you said to put them back into the bobble, I literally tried to put them back into the bobble.
Well, that's a very cool idea. And that's an interesting thing because there are actually baubles that are done with the knit front to back. The only thing that it does differently is that it gives you a tighter pull in on the bottom of the bauble. So sometimes the goal of the designer would be to try and make a different shape for the bauble. And you sometimes will see that with the ones that might have like a ton of stitches where they'll make them almost a teardrop shape, just simply so that you don't end up with so much bulk going through that single stitch. So perfectly legitimate way to do it and a great solution to make them nice and round.
Yep. And I changed the color, the frequent, pardon me, I switched the colors around. So the yellow should have gone in here. And I just didn't like how it popped. So I put the teal in there instead. And I think because I'm switching the sequence of the colors, like making them a 1 instead of a 3 instead of a 4 or whatever, I should still come out okay with my yarn.
Yeah. There's one of those in there that you got away with it just fine because it definitely doesn't use all of the mini. And so that worked out perfectly. And I think it's a really, really beautiful set of colors you've chosen. Yeah. So Tanya, you also mentioned in the chat that you had a question about the difference between using an SSK decrease compared to a PSSO decrease. So this is an interesting thing. And historically, you'll see that there's a difference in terms of where they're coming from and when they're used the most, but they also have a different effect on the knitting. So an SSK decrease works both stitches, and there's various different ways of doing it. So you can slip one knitwise, slip one purlwise, knit through the back loop, or you can slip one purlwise, slip one knitwise, work through the back loop. You can maneuver the stitches so that they sit on the needle in different ways, and that will make them lie in different ways in the knitting when they're done. But they're both knit. And this is where like my age in terms of knitting shows. I've been knitting for 54 years, and we didn't do SSKs like that in the olden days. So we did this older style of English type thing, and it was the pass slip stitch over sort of version. So in that one, what you're doing is you're slipping the first stitch, and then you're knitting the second stitch and passing the first stitch over. And if you think about it, what happens is that it's going to sit on the knitting differently because it actually hasn't been worked. So what it'll do is it'll give you more emphasis along an edge. So it's more commonly used in lace because it will give you a more raised effect. And so you can see it better. So in the case of the large tulips, we're using that stitch. Oh, I guess I could take the spotlight off Tanya so that she can knit him,
Actually, the reason why I brought up that question though was because it was on the Ravel, it was on the forum post, the forum feed. And I tried to respond to it, and I deleted my comment because I don't think that I came out the way I wanted to with what I was saying. And I thought, well, maybe it was a good idea just to bring it up in the Zoom.
Yeah. I decided to address it in the Zoom, and I will go back and comment on that. But yeah, it is all about A, how you have the stitches lie when you're finished, the stitches, and B, how tight are they pulled by, are they worked or not? So when you pass a stitch over, the stitch is not going to sit the same way as if you've knitted it. So SSKs and slip one, pass stitch over, to olden day knitters, they're kind of the same thing. They just give you a different effect, but you would choose one where you want to emphasize or de-emphasize something. So when I'm working a sock gusset, for example, I'll do the one where you slip two stitches in a row, one at a time, and you slip them knitwise. And then you put the left needle through the front of the stitch, and then you knit the two together, because that gives me a very flat angled stitch where you only see one of them. When you do the slip one, knit one, pass the stitch over, the stitch sticks up more, so it's more prominent. So like I say, you'll see that more commonly done with lace because it helps to emphasize the directions of the decreased stitches. So you'll get them often paired with knit two together. And like I say, older lace will tend to use that version just simply because they're trying to emphasize those things. They're using them for shaping, they're using them for outlining. So in this case of this particular tulip, that's the reason why that stitch is used, not an SSK as we more modernly use it. So it's kind of intriguing because when I learned to knit all of those years ago, and I'm pretty sure I saw a dinosaur wander through the front yard when I was a kid. Anyway, you almost never saw an SSK like that. And I think it's because the influence on my mother and grandmother was very much British knitting and lace knitting. So even though they were knitting mittens and hats and scarves and all of that for sale, they would still do that more old style because they were using it for emphasis. And, that's kind of what they had learned. So that's what I did too. And I remember the very first time I ran into a different way of working an SSK, I was like, whoa, you mean you don't have to pass that stitch over? And then I did a happy dance because for some reason that really irritates me. So yeah, it's all about how does the stitch actually lie and how much does it, stick up from the fabric and what kind of emphasis you want to give it. So are there any other questions that people have? Anyone else who would like to show off their beautiful projects? I see a hand up with somebody called Zoom user. I'm not sure if that's just because you had your hand up and Zoom decided to put it up for you, or if you'd actually like to share. I'm betting it's like if you do this and how it automatically puts a hand up, because every time I bring my hands up like this, I see that on my screen. So this is your chance to ask any additional questions. You can ask anything at all. If not, we have that last gift certificate, so let's do that.
Okay, the next winner is Carrie Murphy.
Congratulations to Carrie Murphy. So you'll want to make sure that you email Wendy so she can set up your gift certificate. This has been a lot of fun. I can't believe that we've actually come to the end of our hour already, but I really appreciate all of you coming out for this Zoom, and I love seeing all of your work. It is just so much fun to see your color choices and your stitch choices. I love the creativity that everyone has brought, and I have really enjoyed this. I do see a question in the chat. Will you discuss how to block next time? You bet. So the last Zoom is going to be a chance for us again to share our work, but we're going to talk about blocking and finishing, and we can do some various different ways of weaving in ends as well. Because one of the things that's come to my attention over the last few years is that my mom had taught me to weave in ends very differently from how most people do them. And so I thought, this could be a really interesting conversation, is give you some tips on weaving in ends and where you might use one version versus another. Because I have my own, it's funny how as you get older, you get really opinionated. I have my opinions on what kind of weaving end I like to do in which circumstances. So I would love to share some of that. So thank you, everyone. And I will release you now to go back to your knitting. And make sure to save up your questions. But in the meantime, if you need help, do be sure to contact us. You can ask questions on social media and you can email us directly. So anything that you need, make sure that you let us know, because we are here to help you enjoy your staycation. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your evening. Bye-bye.